final presentation for the afternoon is Maureen Maselko from the Department of History. She will be given a presentation titled Under the Color of Religion, the Formation of Group Identity in Early Modern Ireland. This project was, the faculty mentor on this project was Professor Amy Frolden.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. It's great to see so many of you. So my presentation, as mentioned, is Under the Color of Religion, the Formation of Group Identity in Early Modern Ireland. So even in the 21st century, Ireland is a land marked by division. You have the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. There's Catholics and Protestants. And these geographic and religiously defined social groupings found their source in the changes of early modern Ireland. As religious confession replaced economic standing or ethnic background as the main determinant of group identity in the 17th century, the social landscape of Ireland took on features that we would recognize pretty well today. At first, as I started looking at this, I assumed that the firmly drawn lines separating members of different forms of Christianity came about due to vitriolic antagonism, particularly between followers of the Roman Catholic Church and members of the Church of Ireland. As I began to research, however, I realized that my initial thesis missed the point. The role of religious antagonism was much smaller than I had initially supposed, and served more as a justification for the split in later years than as a catalyst. The facts presented a different culprit. While such religious conflicts certainly played a role in the crystallization of these opposing groups, for at least one influential sector of the population, the Old English, the self-identification as primarily Catholic instead of English had another cause. Between O'Neill's rebellion at the turn of the 17th century and the rising of 1641, groups that did not previously work together congealed into composite, unchangeable organisms. In fact, the general outlines of group identity in Ireland by 1641 would remain inconsistent over the next several centuries. The self-identification of Ireland as a whole had shifted as a result of the Norman conquest in the 12th century. Grudgingly, the Irish natives began to accept the English families that settled alongside them and entwined throughout the centuries with their leading families. Both the Gaelic tribes and their Old English neighbors, however, disapproved of the onslaught of the New English, who entered Ireland in the late 16th century. This newest group arriving from England posed an economic and political threat to the status quo that had held sway in Ireland since the Norman conquest. In addition, the New English prompted a search for more defined self-identity on the part of the Old English. All residents of Ireland had to undergo a cognitive shift to cope with the change in demographics, but the Old English in particular struggled to craft and maintain their own unique designation as the intermediary group. The resultant group identity in Ireland developed in large part along religious instead of solely ethnic lines. The primary tendency in Ireland was to create strata of wealth and influence based on ownership of goods as well as ethnic background. However, despite repeated insistence by wealthy Old English families, the colonizing government had other plans. In the case of the Old English, group identification in terms of religion was imposed from the outside, particularly by the English government, and only gradually embraced on the ground. That the religious distinction existed cannot be argued. However, the adopting of religion as the primary and sometimes exclusive component of identity resulted from governmental policies, and was only secondarily influenced by the religious antagonism and propaganda available in early modern Ireland. As a result of the English attempt to enact the Protestant Reformation in Ireland, the religious landscape of the colony changed in crucial ways. The great majority of the population remained Catholic, and although the established Church of Ireland spread across the island, its services could rarely boast of more than meager attendance. With the arrival of the Scots in Ulster or Northern Ireland in 1607, Ireland found itself divided into regions by religious preference. Catholicism clearly had a greater following in Ireland, even when banned, than did the Church of Ireland. The established church, the Church of Ireland, drew its adherents from the New English and the most anglicized members of other groups. Anyone who wished to rise significantly in the Irish government had to belong to the Church of Ireland, due to its established status and the time-varying illegality of Catholicism. Nevertheless, the vast majority of the population of Ireland continued to practice the Catholic faith, either openly or in secret masses with fugitive priests. Governmental officials noted high levels of recusancy or refusal to attend Anglican services among the Irish Catholics, despite occasional persecutions. The Old English, or Anglo-Irish, found themselves in a unique role among the Irish population, as somehow intermediate between the English and the Irish. The position of this group within Irish society was redefined over the course of the medieval and early modern period. Despite their discrete social standing as Englishmen in an Irish landscape, these wealthy families became rather unwillingly grouped with the native Irish, who were often considered uncivilized. For the Old English in particular, the succeeding waves of English domination in Ireland brought significant changes in fortune and position. When they first arrived with or just after the Norman conquest of 1169, the Old English served as primary exploiters of the new colony. For the next several generations, this group was simply known as the English, or the foreigners. As the Normans settled into the fabric of life in Ireland, assimilation with the Gaelic Irish naturally began to occur. In fact, the prevalence of this assimilation with the Irish was the rationale behind a series of laws prohibiting Irish practices. The new English settlers who entered Ireland during the Tudor period became an economic and especially political threat as power began to shift in that direction. As a result of the arrival of this new group, those formerly called the English needed a clarifying title. In 1534, they were named the English Irish, although this appellation gave way to Old English by the 1590s. These Old English united with the Old Irish in opposing the power of the New English and resisting changes to the status quo. As the Tudor period drew to a close, a perception emerged of religion as one divisive distinction between Old and New English in Ireland. In ethnicity, language, and wealth, the Old English and New English found common ground, so the only factor of distinction was culture. Insofar as the Old English had adopted Irish practices and become part of the Gaelic way of life, to that extent they differed profoundly from more recent English transplants. However, because not all of the Old English had assimilated to the same degree, the single factor of religion became a marker of difference. Religion held an extremely important place in the Irish worldview and enabled polemicists to find a generally binary system of categorization. The New English, who had transplanted from England since the Reformation had taken root there, tended to be members of the Church of Ireland. The Old English generally continued to espouse the Roman Catholic faith, just as did the native Irish. Catholicism was illegal from the first implementation of the Reformation, and gradually exceptions for the wealthy Old English began to disappear. As the Tudor period ended and the Stuart era began in 1603, officials started to enforce recusancy laws and collect fines from those who habitually neglected the services of the Church of Ireland. The Old English who clung to Catholicism therefore found themselves repeatedly and inexorably joined conceptually to the native Irish who shared their beliefs. This common persecution pushed the Old English and the Irish together against the New English and the throne. Various maneuvers by the English government tended to ally the Old English with the native Irish for ease of governance. Many of the native Irish clan leaders were known to be rebellious, which made this grouping all the more uncomfortable to the loyal Old English. Both groups remained Catholic despite the best attempts of the Protestant Reformation and the establishment of the Church of Ireland as the state church. Due to the illegality of Catholicism, the distinctions between these two recusant groups gradually disappeared in the perception of the royal government, until all alike were considered seditious and untrustworthy. With this categorization imposed upon them, the Old English had little alternative but to turn to their co-religionists as allies. The initial fear of the English government transformed into a reality brought about in large part by policies motivated by that very fear. Religion served as a defining characteristic in the early modern Irish conception of the world and reality. The Irish conceived of the communal and ritualistic Catholic faith as their natural religious heritage. The Irish identity was bound up with the stories and faith of St. Patrick and the brimming treasury of his fellow Hibernian saints. Catholicism permeated all aspects of life in Ireland, and a Protestant confession without saints, relics, and sacraments lacked the rich cultural fabric to which the Irish were accustomed. For a segment of this population, opposition to the English governors provided an extra incentive to hold on to the Catholic tradition. Relations between England and Ireland had never been especially positive, and the Irish proved themselves remarkably unwilling to give up their religious traditions to pacify the conquering English. According to George Carew, the president of Munster, religious differences served as a cover for the alliance between the mere Irish and the Old English. Old English families were Catholic bastions that tended to disapprove of the sudden change in religious preference of the government. The joining of the Old English with the Irish benefited from the discovery of increased cultural affinity between the two groups. These wealthy family networks also attempted to appease the English government by emphasizing the distinction between their spiritual faith and their temporal allegiance. As James took over the throne of England in 1603, the Old English, led by Catholic Bishop of Armagh, Peter Lombard, continually strove to convince the government that they remained loyal Englishmen, as well as being faithful Catholics. The English government increasingly categorized the Irish by religious affiliation, despite the tradition of excusing Old English recusancy. When the Old English had tried every other way to regain their rights as leading English citizens, they turned to the last resort. Ideological union with the native Irish did not fit into the agenda of the Old English at the turn of the century, but the situation had changed by 1641. The Old English were pushed generally reluctantly into an alliance with the Irish Catholics in their struggle for rights. From this very alliance would come, in 1641, the Catholic rebellion so feared by the English government. Thank you for your attention for this presentation. Are there any questions that I can answer?
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about some of the interesting sources you used to find your research?
Sure, absolutely. I looked at a variety of different sources, including letters and the papers of different families. For instance, the quote that I have from George Carew, from which also the title of this presentation is taken, was from his papers that he compiled during his stay in Ireland. I looked at letters, I looked at travel logs, I guess you would call them, descriptions of people who had traveled through Ireland and were writing about what they had found. I looked at polemical works, pamphlets that were published by people either from a very Catholic perspective or a very Protestant perspective, attacking the other side. I looked at I already said letters, I looked at laws that had been passed by the English government and things that were going on in the Irish Parliament at the time, as well as secondary sources, other historians who have looked at similar related materials. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.